At the end of a fast, you have two directions that you can go. You can continue to burn a little bit of fat, or you can bring it to a screeching halt. It's really that simple. And to make it a better visual, I want you to imagine that you are in the gym and you are absolutely thriving right now. Okay, you're sweating, you feel like you're just burning fat, it feels great. And then all of a sudden, your body seizes up and you can't move anymore. You're like, okay, great, well, all the fat loss kind of stopped. It's kind of like that in not a literal way, but a figurative kind of way. Okay, when you're fasting and you break your fast a certain way, you can continue the benefits of a fast to a certain degree, or you can bring them to a screeching halt. And it's because there is an anti-lipolytic, anti-sort of fat mobilization effect of insulin. Does that mean that carbohydrates are bad because carbohydrates spike insulin? 100% not. Okay, I am someone that believes in sprinkling in carbohydrates now and then, and even having carbohydrates alongside your fasting protocol. But when you break your fast, you have to remember one very important thing. With great power comes great responsibility. Okay, you become very insulin sensitive during a fast. Insulin sensitivity is a good thing because you can soak up more carbohydrates into the muscle. It is a good thing because you can potentially use that insulin sensitivity to draw more protein into a muscle. But that insulin sensitivity can also be bad because with everything there is a good and a bad. I'm not saying you shouldn't set out to get insulin sensitive, but if insulin sensitivity is increased, so is the anti-fat burning effect of insulin. So that means when you do have insulin in the equation, it shuts down fat loss really quick. Now, I have a very interesting study to paint a picture with this because it's one of the first studies that really demonstrates that intermittent fasting, even over the short term, has a big increase or triggers a big increase in insulin sensitivity. So this study was published in the Journal of Applied Physiology, and it's quickly becoming one of my most favorite studies. Okay, it took a look at subjects that were doing a fast every second day. So every second day they would fast for about 20 hours. They did this for 15 days. Why is this one of my favorites? Because that's exactly the length of fast that I like and somewhat of the frequency that I like. A few times per week for 20 hours. Okay, they found after 2 weeks or 15 days, pretty remarkable responses. They found that insulin-mediated glucose uptake had increased from 6.3 milligrams per kilogram per minute to 7.3 milligrams per kilogram per minute compared to baseline. That means, very simply, insulin sensitivity increased after just 15 days in a very significant way. Huge benefits, and they're not even fasting all that much, but that's not the point of the study right now. They also found with this that there was a greater insulin-induced inhibition of lipolysis. So let me paint a picture for you real quick here. When we have fat in a storage form, our fat is stored in what are called triglycerides. What happens is these triglycerides get broken down into fatty acids and a glycerol backbone. In order to get broken down, they need something called hormone-sensitive lipase. It's like a pair of scissors, and this pair of scissors cuts up the triglyceride so that the triglyceride can now be mobilized and burned. Well, insulin, through a multiple different series of actions, inhibits the scissors. It rusts the scissors, so now the scissors don't work. So we can't cut up the fat. We can't cut up the triglyceride. Okay, this is called the anti-lipolytic effect of insulin. When we are more insulin sensitive, it freezes up the scissors even faster. So the moment that you have a bunch of carbohydrates after breaking a fast, you are seizing the lipolysis that could continue to occur otherwise. And again, people are going to take that chunk of the video and probably make a video about me and saying, oh, see, he's saying carbs are immediately going to stop fat. In a very specific circumstance like this, that is probably the case. Essentially, in short, the spike in insulin that normally has an anti-lipolytic effect has an amplified anti-lipolytic effect. And I'm not pulling random research. Like, it's fairly well known that insulin is anti-lipolytic, that it does stop fat loss, but it's usually so short and such a small spike, it's not worth really talking about too much. But when you have a big spike at the end of a fast, yeah, you've got this beautiful fast where you're burning fat, or possibly, right? This is all colloquial, right? Possibly, and then all of a sudden you have this big wall. Do you want a brick wall or do you want a gentle slope? I want a gentle slope because I want to still continue to reap benefits of fasting. And I have more about this, more from this study, more mechanistic action that might help you out a little bit more as to when to implement carbs. So we'll talk about that in just a second. But when you break your fast, I keep it simple. Protein, and that's it. Sometimes some fat, it depends on the situation. Sometimes a lower glycemic carb, but it depends on the situation. I did put a link down below for ButcherBox. It's who I've been using for about half a decade now. So ButcherBox is an online meat delivery company, but they really paved the way when it came down to grass-fed, grass-finished beef. That's really where they got their name. So if you're making burgers, I definitely recommend you try them out. So you can get it delivered right to your doorstep. You can end up on a monthly. It's really cool. They're a big sponsor on this channel. They've sponsored this video, which makes it awesome because I can create the content that I do. So there's a link down below that you can use to check out ButcherBox and try getting meat delivered to your doorstep. And it doesn't stop with beef, right? You can go with ground beef, you can go steaks, but you can also get chicken. They have some fish options like sockeye salmon. It just goes on and on. So that link is down below in the description. Definitely recommend you check them out. What happens is when we have an increase in insulin sensitivity, we also have an increase in what's called adenopectin. Adenopectin is a great hormone. It's a hormone that's secreted by fat, and it increases insulin sensitivity. But with an increase in insulin sensitivity, we need to think about one thing too. It also increases the affinity for glucose to go into a fat cell, because the fat cells soak up glucose too, not just muscle cells. So when we have an increase in adenopectin, it means that a fat cell will soak up more glucose at the end of a fast. Now this isn't always a bad thing, right? This can happen normally, but if you have too much happening at one time, what can happen is something called de novo lipogenesis. De novo lipogenesis is where via different enzymes like pyruvate dehydrogenase and acetyl coenzyme A carboxylase, these enzymes will break down glucose and turn it into fat via de novo lipogenesis. But this occurs inside of a fat cell. So end of a fast, bunch of carbohydrates, spike your insulin. Those carbohydrates rush into a fat cell. That fat cell then can turn that fat or carbs into fat. But it doesn't stop there. Insulin also can exacerbate or activate more of the pyruvate dehydrogenase and more of the acetyl coenzyme A carboxylase, the enzymes that are mainly responsible for creating fat through de novo lipogenesis. So not only do you have more glucose going into a fat cell, you have more enzymatic activity happening inside each individual fat cell. So you have multiple stations where you're building fat, but each one of those multiple stations is working overtime. So you're kind of double whammy effect there. So again, it sounds like I'm just anti-carb, but the point of this is just to kind of steer you in the right direction. So after you break your fast with protein or very low glycemic carbs, or maybe a little bit of fat if you know what you're doing. I don't recommend saturated fat right when you break a fast. Sorry for a different day. Saturated fat is fine, just not when you break a fast. It's hard on the gut. Okay, so you have your protein, and then later on, what you want to do is you want to kind of periodize and increase your carbohydrates in a pyramid sort of fashion. Okay, so you ramp up as you go, and then you bring them down as the night goes on, with your peak carbohydrates coming in probably around dinner time, so that you're actually getting a serotonin melatonin effect that can help you sleep, and then bring them down after that. Okay, another thing that's very important is that you're trying to combine your carbohydrates with protein. I can't remember the study itself, but there was a study that did demonstrate that protein, not fat, but protein 2x'd the power of like a glucose response compared to fat alongside carbohydrates. So in other words, when you had carbohydrates with protein, it was 2 times more powerful at reducing the blood sugar than having fat with carbohydrates. So if you had to choose between having rice and chicken or rice and coconut oil, the rice and chicken is going to give you much less of a glucose spike and a subsequent insulin spike. Okay, so what I recommend is eat your protein first and then have the carbohydrates, and have the fats however you kind of want interstitially within there, and the veggies as well, but mainly protein first, then carbs and everything else. Simply that order of operations and how you eat can make a big difference in these spikes as well and attenuate those responses that might have that anti-lipolytic effect. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel, and I'll see you tomorrow.